Hey guys, it's Faye from Solarflow and I am back with another video. Today's topic is a deep dive behind the veil energy read on the serial killer Ted Bundy. And even though I always say in my videos, if this sounds like an interesting topic, stick around, and if not, I'll catch you in another video, I'm actually going to say on this one, stick around anyway. Because first and foremost, the information that came in is interesting. But secondly, and more importantly, there's an important thing that came out in the exploration of his energy at the end, which was his contribution to humanity, which I know sounds funny because he was a serial killer. What was his contribution? Death and destruction. And that's what makes this video so interesting. So please do stick around. I promise it will be worth it. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with who Ted Bundy was, he was one of the most prolific serial killers, and he had confessed to killing at least 30 women between the years of 1974 and 1978. After all of his appeals were basically extinguished and he was not going to get a stay of execution, he was ultimately, because he did receive the death penalty, he was ultimately executed in 1989. So we're going to first explore what are the components that, at least in this case of Ted Bundy, comprised the elements of his personality. What were the triggers that led to him becoming a serial killer? And then what was the unexpected thing that came out of the exploration of him? So first I'm going to say that when I sat down to look into him, before I get to that, let me go back for a second. I'm going to make references to Bryan Kohberger, which I've done a video on him as well. And he is the lead suspect in the murder of the Idaho students. And the video is linked down below if you haven't seen it and you want to watch it. But I even remember when I had done the video on Bryan Kohberger, I had actually said he's giving me Ted Bundy vibes. And as soon as I got that, that was like the impetus to want to look into Ted Bundy. And actually, also interestingly enough, looking into Bryan set me on like this whole path, this whole new trajectory of wanting to look into true crime. And yeah, I had done like some here and there before. This just opened up like a whole new side to the behind the veil energy work that I was doing in wanting to explore what were the psychological components that were the impetus for people in their crimes and what was going on behind the veil as well energetically. So yes, I'm going to be doing a few more videos of these. I have a few more that I've channeled and a few more that you guys have requested before I'm ready to put this to bed. But I'm definitely like really enjoying the true crime themes right now. So when I did sit down to actually look into Ted Bundy's energy, he acknowledged energetically that somebody wanted to connect with him. And I saw the energetic representation of who Ted Bundy was, but he was keeping himself removed and aloof. So he basically wanted to remain like mysterious and detached, at least for now. But I was not easily deterred. No. Again, I'm like all about the true crime stories right now. So I wasn't going to give up so easily. So I really stayed with him. And I think he realized, okay, she's not going away. So then he tried a different tactic. And the way he came in to me was he came in full and he conceded, that's the word that came in, he conceded that I am potent at reading people's energy. And then he asked me if it's because I was a witch. And when he asked me if it's because I'm a witch, he did this. He gave me like the sly side glance with like that like sly little smile as well. And I was like, oh my God, Ted Bundy is low-key flirting with me. But I realized that this was his effort to distract and disarm me. That he was not necessarily flirting for the sake of flirting. He was doing it with a goal and purpose in mind. And even when he was alive, that was very much his MO, his modus operandi. He would attempt to come across as disarming. And there's actually a number of cases in which he would approach women where he was wearing a sling on one of his arms to make it appear as if he was literally fit and really in the three-dimensional, very literally disarmed, that he only had use of one of his arms. So he would approach women and ask for their help loading something into his car because he was disarmed. So this was his MO, to energetically disarm people. Why was he doing that? So it's very interesting because whereas, for example, I'm going to reference Bryan Kohberger for a moment. Bryan Kohberger didn't need external validation from the world for him to come to understand himself and for him to understand that he was different. He just knew he was different. Ted Bundy was different. Ted learned through his interactions through the world, and it was through those interactions that he came to understand that he was different. Because he would observe the way in which people would respond to him energetically, which was sometimes they would like even take a step back, or like it was almost like they were startled around him. Because whereas Bryan Kohberger had that tightly coiled energy that was flowing just beneath the surface of his skin, Ted had it external. It was always with him and it was always around him, just like his aura. So, for example, if you have a friend and that friend is always like doom and gloom and the world sucks and everything is horrible, and you might be, if you see them coming, like you're going to brace yourself like, oh no, here she comes and she's just going to talk about everything that's wrong in her life. You have to like energetically prepare yourself for it because you know who that person is when they come in. So when Ted would come into people's sphere, they were disarmed by him. And it may not have even been something consciously that they were aware of. It wasn't like this thought like, oh, I don't know, he makes me feel uncomfortable. But there was always something there. It was either like that moment where he first would come in, or it was like that pit in their stomach. So it was very much that he would learn through his interactions with the world how different he was. And he would observe the way in which he would disarm people. And that led him to doing two things. First and foremost, that led to the construction of his facade. And his facade was somebody that was very charming, very charismatic. He was well-spoken. And it also literally led to him taking on the persona of somebody that was disarmed, because it was a way to get people to help him and to acquiesce to him. Because without that, without him appearing to be disarmed, people wouldn't be so likely to help him out. So he had this very intense energy, as did Bryan Kohberger, but the intense energy was all around him. And whereas, here's also another interesting thing about the difference between these two. So whereas Bryan Kohberger didn't necessarily want to see through the completion of the fantasies that he was having, because through the completion of the fantasy, he would experience some sort of a release of that tightly bound, coiled energy, it was different with Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy had a very, very rich fantasy life, because it was through the completion of these fantasies in his mind that he would experience the release. That he would, it was coming in almost like afterwards he could almost sigh. He could almost feel at ease, and he could almost feel relaxed in himself and in his body, because he very much always felt removed and always felt different, and he always felt like he was not of this world. And we're going to explore a little bit more about that as we get into the character analysis of him as well, because some interesting things came in. But this is also why Ted Bundy would kill, and he would kill so much, because it was only after the completion of the actual killing that, again, he felt like he could sigh, that he felt the release, that he felt unencumbered and free from himself. Now, if you're wondering, what are some of the hallmarks that comprised the formation of such a prolific serial killer? Which is, first, I'm going to kind of tackle this idea of, is it nature, is it nurture, right? Are people born this way, or are they made this way? And I'm going to say that strictly in the three-dimensional, it's both. You can have the ingredients, so to say, of somebody that would be prone to this, but if not for particular events that happen in their environment, it would not necessarily create the serial killer. That's strictly in the three-dimensional. But as we know through the other videos in which I've spoken about this, behind the veil, everybody serves a particular purpose. There is no such thing as an accidental serial killer, not in the big picture, not in the grand scheme of things, because we all have a soul contract. So we can try to create the understanding of what brought about this kind of person into the world, but that's also kind of missing the point that on a spiritual level, they had a soul contract to come in and to be this person and to do this. Okay, but in case you were wondering, what actually comprises, what are the hallmarks that would comprise such a person and compel them to be such a prolific serial killer? There were actually a couple of things that happened in Ted's childhood that paved the way in the three-dimensional, on this side of the veil, that comprised who he became later on in life. And one of them was something very, very notable that happened in his childhood. So back in the early 1950s, his mother chose to have him out of wedlock. This was a huge, monumental societal no-no back then. Because back then, if a woman did choose to become pregnant, she would quietly disappear from her life for a period of about 1 year. She would probably go to a monastery or a nunnery. She would have her child and she would put it up for adoption. And then she would just slink back into her life, and people were too polite to comment or to make it apparent as if they had ever noticed. They probably were suspicious of why she had disappeared, but they would never say anything. So her choosing to have this child out of wedlock, whoa. Now, as if that wasn't monumental enough, what was told to Ted was that his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. So the very, very first relationship that he had with a woman was one that was built on a lie. And that had a profound impact and effect on him. Because again, this is somebody that learned through his interactions with the world. He was not an island of one where he needed nobody and he needed nothing. This was somebody that very much learned through the world and learned through his relationships with the world. He was also very, very clever. He was very, very smart. And he had a lot of introspection and self-awareness. And the profound effect that this had on him, being that it was the primary, really, really close and intimate relationship that he was having with a woman, it was not sexually intimate, but it was a very emotionally intimate relationship with not only a woman, but with a family, was one that was built on a lie. And that triggered in him the way that he took that information in, and the way in which he actually absorbed it and digested it, was that it was a reflection of him. And this triggered in him a sense of at least through the way he was taking it, a sense of unworthiness, that he was somehow not good enough to be told the truth early on. Because at least in the way, in his mind, if I was a better person, they would have told me this earlier. Without his understanding the bigger global understanding of societally, that this was really, really a big deal. But he didn't understand that. So as much as he learned through the world around him, he was missing, it was like an incomplete understanding. And this in him caused him to view himself as bad. He was bad, he was unworthy, because if he was good, if he was worthy, he would have been told the truth. So this was the very, very first fundamental wounding that he experienced on an egocentric level. And it caused him to have a shift in the way that he viewed himself. He was not actually a bad kid. Not that any kid can really be bad per se, but he was definitely not like a bad kid growing up. He was very curious and he was very clever. But this caused him to feel powerless and out of control. And the unintended consequence of that feeling inside of him was that this actually led him to have bondage fantasies. And I was not shown that this was something that he had seen and he took to it like a fish to water. It was the bondage fantasies was a way of him reframing the sense of unworthiness that he experienced through this. And it was a way of him there, through these bondage fantasies, of giving him a sense of power and control, and because it was not one that he had ordinarily. So whereas he felt powerless, now he felt powerful. Whereas he would feel out of control through these fantasies, he now felt in control. He also had very, very rich fantasies and a very, very rich inner world. So it was shown to me that he could, as much as he liked to learn through the world around him at large, he could very much like withdraw into himself, and he could be alone to play or experience the world or experience himself. So this is not somebody that didn't have any level of self-awareness. He had a lot of internal self-awareness about him. And an interesting thing that came up, again, being somebody that learned through the world and learned through his interactions with the world, was that he would observe the disarming effect that he had on people, men included. So whereas, again, I'm not sure if I said this earlier on, whereas Bryan Kohberger didn't need the evidence from the external world that he was different, Ted Bundy actually did. He needed to see the way in which he was received by people to understand. Maybe he kind of sensed it, like, oh, people are responding to me, but he needed the actual evidence from the interactions with other people to understand that he was actually, in fact, disarming. So through Ted learning about these things, he learned to construct the facade, and he learned to charm in order to disarm. It was not coincidental that this is someone who chose to physically appear to be disarmed. That was, again, part of the MO. That was part of the facade. And through his experiences with the world, he learned to refine himself. So whereas before he was just charming, he learned to refine himself as well. So now he was learning to become very, very articulate and very well spoken. I'm also going to tell you what was shown to me was that he didn't set out to kill, at least not initially. Rather, this was a slow progression on his part. But again, it was a slow progression on his part because this is someone who learned about himself through his interactions with the world. Now, because he was somebody that always, like, he realized that he had this effect on people, even men, he also never fully felt like he was in this world or of this world, and he always felt somewhat removed from it. And what was actually shown to me and this is something that led to the progression of the actual killings on his part, was that he started off, first with the bondage fantasies, but then he also graduated, one could say, to being a peeping Tom. Now, his graduating to the actions of being a peeping Tom, so peeping Tom, for anyone who's not familiar, is, let's say, someone could be walking down the street, they happen to like glance up at a window and they see that a woman is getting undressed, and they choose to stay there and watch. They get a thrill out of it. So now they might go walking around the neighborhood the same time every night, hoping they're going to catch this woman in a state of undress again. But then that thrill is not enough, so they start going to other neighborhoods trying to catch women getting undressed. Then they graduate from that into, it's not enough that they're standing on the street watching a woman getting undressed, but it's one in which they're actually like going up to a window and they're getting really, really close and they're peeking inside to catch a woman in a state of undress. And another expression of being a peeping Tom is where that actually leads to theft. So now they know the kind of lingerie that a woman wears. When that woman is now not home, they might break into the home and they might, take like panties from her. So it's a progression of not getting caught when they're pushing these boundaries that can lead to more and more corrupt behavior. And for Ted Bundy, that was very much the case, where he got the thrills initially, but he also wasn't necessarily getting caught doing it, so that made him bolder. And because this is somebody that never really felt completely at ease in the world, and because this is someone that had self-knowledge, he had the recognition that he was different. And this is interesting, that he didn't have to do, he chose to do. He felt, I'm going to more say he felt compelled. He felt compelled to do corrupt shit to appear normal. And I was like, can I get clarification on this? Because this is literally the way it came in. I'm like, I don't even understand this. Can you explain this to me? And what was shown to me was that he would actually need to, if he was going on a date with a woman, he actually needed to get it out of his system, so to say, by going and being a peeping Tom and looking in on a woman. He felt compelled to do something corrupt so that he could therefore go on and do something normal. Because again, he didn't ever really feel at ease. He always felt different in the world. And the way in which that manifested in him was the only way that he could appear to be normal was to do something corrupt. And he loved the thrill and the rush of adrenaline. And he needed that to get through the more banal parts of his life. He was very much a hunter that loved to hunt. Okay, so we're having somebody that experienced a big trauma, a big lie that set up the foundation that he had with all women, which was that women cannot be trusted. He enjoyed bondage fantasies. He enjoyed being a peeping Tom and wasn't necessarily getting caught being a peeping Tom, and that continued this progression. And then the next very, very big hallmark happened that led to him becoming a serial killer, which was that he was in a relationship with a woman in law school, and she ended the relationship with him. Now, he was very taken in with her, and her choosing to end the relationship reignited that earlier wound that he experienced as a child, which triggered in him that same feeling of unworthiness that he had experienced back then. So now he was an adult experiencing an uncomfortable sensation, which was a feeling of unworthiness. And just like when he was a child, he had found a way to reframe that, which was through the bondage fantasies. He now needed to find a new way to reframe this sense of unworthiness that he was feeling. It triggered in him very much this feeling of being unworthy. And the way in which he reframed it on a psychological level was that he was going to make sure that no woman was ever going to be able to leave him again. And the way in which they were never going to be able to leave him again was through his own actions, through the killing of the woman. They can't leave me because they're dead. They're dead because I killed them. And that is what was going on with Ted Bundy psychologically. I cannot be left again because they are no longer alive. They are no longer alive because I killed them. So it was fulfilling the reframing of the sense of unworthiness inside of him. I'm unworthy, someone's always going to leave me. He's taking the power back. No, now they can't leave me. They're dead. They're dead because I killed them. So they can't leave him, and he was feeling powerful because of it. And I wrote that they could never leave him if they were already dead. They were forever with him through the act of him being the one that had killed them. Now, what was also shown to me was that Ted also had, he feared being rejected sexually. Even though he was a good-looking, charismatic guy, you know, that was the facade, but he very much feared being rejected sexually. And he also had a lot of performance anxiety. And this was due to the fact that, again, I'm going to take you back to his interest in bondage fantasies. So a regular sexual act, by comparison to the bondage fantasies, would be banal. But he also recognized he couldn't necessarily play out the fantasies that he had with women because that would send them running. You know, they wouldn't want to be in like a relationship with a guy that's like, I want to do this corrupt shit to you. So he had the desire to engage in bondage sexual fantasies, but he understood that he couldn't do that to people necessarily. So the reality of the sexual encounters that he was having were incongruent with the sexual fantasies that he was having in his mind. And by comparison, they seemed banal. So it caused him to have a lot of performance anxiety because it wasn't necessarily doing it for him. Okay? So that was another reason why he would actually abduct a woman. And not all of the victims were actually like abducted with him being like physically disarmed. He abducted like women from hotels, and like he was very resourceful. But he would actually abduct them, and he would take them to, he would knock them out, he would knock them unconscious. He would take them to a remote location in the woods where if they were starting to come to, he would render them unconscious again, which, this is a little graphic and I'm sorry. At that time, he would, I don't know if I can say the word, but he would have non-consensual sex with them. First of all, they weren't conscious. Second of all, they didn't agree to it. Like, he literally would take them. And so he would do that first and foremost. And that would bypass the sexual performance issues that he would have because they're not even conscious. So that kind of took care of that. Plus, it was sexually dysfunctional that he would need to do this to have a sexual relationship. And because it was dysfunctional, it actually worked for him because it was not banal. So it was just like this really weird, weird's the wrong word. It was this really interesting dynamic of what was going on with him energetically that was manifesting in the way in which he was actually interacting with the world. And in addition to that, he would kill the women, usually by strangling them. And then, he would continue to have a sexual interaction with the deceased body, because that too would bypass the fear of sexual rejection, because now it's not somebody that's just knocked out, it's somebody that's dead. So that very much also fulfilled or took care of the fear of sexual rejection that he experienced. Plus, in addition to that, he really, really liked, because again, this is someone that felt powerless and out of control as a child. He really liked the feeling of literally holding a woman's life in his hands, because this is a very, very physical way to kill somebody. This is not like you're holding a gun and you're shooting them and you're removed from them physically. It's literally hands-on. He loved he just loved the feeling of extinguishing their life with his own hands and feeling the pulse start to slip away as he was strangling them. And because they were taken to a remote location, he knew where they were. He would go back for maybe some period of time thereafter, and he would engage with the body, or at the very least, he enjoyed being with it, because again, it reinforced this sense of power and control that he had. He did this. Now, you might be wondering, this is a good-looking guy. Why do you have to do all of this? He could have gone on to have a normal relationship, sure. But again, he already had energetically the wounding in him that made him feel worthless, or at the very least, question his worthiness. And he felt that women were untrustworthy. And this was reinforced by the woman that he was in a relationship with that had actually left him in law school. So he was just very, very massively energetically and emotionally wounded. And with it, he had the fear of performance anxiety. So all of these things were going on that were the perfect storm. Oh, and here's another thing that I think I had left out. Interestingly enough, it's been noted that a lot of his victims actually resembled this woman he was dating in law school that had ended the relationship with him. So again, that's very much playing into this wanting to reframe that woman leaving him, because he was choosing intentionally women that looked like her, but now again, that woman couldn't leave him. So it was his way of just reframing what had actually happened by choosing victims that resembled this woman. Okay, let me see what else I got here. Yep, so we have the performance anxiety that he experienced, and he loved the feeling of having power and control over these women. Now, at the point that I concluded this, looking into him, and I had gotten through the killing, I started to hear he was sent here. And I was like, wait, what? Can you give me a clarification on that? Because I kept hearing it over and over again. He was sent here, he was sent here, he was sent here. And I was like, okay, hold on. So was this a soul contract that he had, or was he sent here? Obviously, it was both, because he had to agree to come into this incarnation. But the impetus of all of this was him being sent here. And I was like, okay, why? So I asked, for what? And I was told that this was the beginning of the sowing of the seeds in our collective understanding that looks can be deceiving. And I'm going to explain that. So he was the beginning steps in a longer process of humanity's evolution to not put so much focus and to not put so much stock and attention into the way that things look, but how they make you feel. Because all of the people that he had interacted with, even if it was not a conscious thought that they had had, they all felt that something was off. It was either the way physically, like maybe, the feeling of having like the hair on your neck stand up, or like they would get that feeling in the pit of their stomach. But he looked so disarming and he was so charismatic and charming. He actually, I believe, was even able to talk himself out of like being arrested. I think they had like pulled his car over and they found that he had like all of these questionable things in his car. Like he had rope and he had like, but in the police officers talking to him, he was so well spoken and so charming and charismatic that they were thinking, surely this can't be the guy that we're looking for. So this was the very, very first planting of the seeds that would then start to sprout our understanding collectively, not to put so much stock into how things look, but into how things feel. Not to so much believe that because somebody looks good, they must inherently be good, but what do their actions actually say about them? How does this person make me feel intuitively? So this was to teach us collectively discernment and to teach us to trust our intuition, that when something doesn't feel right, it's to understand that evil does in fact exist here and to wisen up, and it's to make us a little bit tougher. So in a way, all of these, as I will refer to them, consciously challenged people, have a larger purpose in the big picture, which is their soul contract is in coming here is not necessarily just to affect the victims themselves and the victims' families, but they're serving a piece in a much larger puzzle. So whereas the souls of his victims also had a soul contract to agree to come into this incarnation and to be taken out by him, he too had a soul contract in coming here. And the victims, perhaps, their piece in this puzzle was that through their passing, collectively, more than 30 women, was to tragically die at his hands for the betterment of humanity. But he had a soul contract too, and it was also for the betterment of humanity. And this is the unexpected thing that had come out of this, which is, I feel, when there is something on the national stage that really captures all of our attention, such as the prolific murders that Ted Bundy had perpetrated, right? And we don't actually even know the full number of lives that he took, because he had made some comments that left room for interpretation. Like, I think someone had said to him, so how many women did you kill? Like 30, 39, 40? And he said, one more and you'll be right. So what was that one more? Was it 40 or 41? Was it 300 and some? Was it 390? Was it 139? So there was some ambiguity in what he had said. So the full breadth and scope of his proliferation of killing is not fully even known to this day. And also, which is to say that towards the end of his life, when he realized he had kind of like played out all of he had extinguished all of his bids for, to stay the execution, he actually started to open up tremendously, and he started to be of value, which he really, really liked because he had these questionable feelings of self-worth. But he actually started to open up and talk with the police authorities at that time. They would come to him and they would say, okay, so we have this case. We want to come to understand the way that a serial killer actually operates so we can come to understand who we're up against here. And at that time, he was actually working with the police authorities on giving them insight and giving them understanding into the way that the mind of a serial killer actually would operate. So this very much appealed to him on a soul level, because he finally was able to, through, and I'm not giving him a pass, understand that, but it was through his working with the authorities towards the end of his life that he was actually able to, on a three-dimensional level, quell those questionable beliefs he had about his worthiness, because here he felt really, really worthy. He felt really, really helpful. He was really, really helping them. But I think I went off on a tangent there. Okay, but it was through this tragedy of all of the murders that he had actually perpetrated, and again, he only, confessed to about 30. We don't know the actual number of people he killed. But it was through, when something so notable happens on the world stage, we might have this desire to separate the killer from ourselves by labeling them. They're a monster, or they're crazy. And we like to give them labels like that, because then they're not like us. They're something other than us. They're different than us. But that is part of the reason that he was sent here. And that is part of the reason he did truly always feel different. Not because he was crazy, not because he was a monster, but because he had to be so fundamentally broken on the inside that would manifest on the outside through his destruction and through his breaking things and through his killing people. So understand that while we may have this desire to label people crazy or monsters, just like their victims had a soul contract to say, I'm going to come in and I'm going to be one of the victims for the betterment of humanity, he had it too. And just like their souls had to agree to come in to be killed, he had to agree to come in and be the killer. Now imagine for a moment, before the soul agrees to come in, and knowing the part that they are going to play, and knowing that their contribution to humanity, that they are going to be responsible for death, devastation, and destruction. Imagine being that soul before we come in and agreeing and saying, okay, I agree to come in and to be the arbiter of all of these horrible things for the betterment of all of mankind. So I want to share this with the hope of perhaps reframing this idea that they're different, that they're monsters, that they're crazy. But to reframe it with this idea that it's a highly evolved soul that will agree to come in and to do all of these things, and to agree to do it for the betterment of all of mankind. And that he had to know prior to coming in that he was going to have to grow up in a level of dysfunction that would compel him to hurt the world. That he would have to be broken inside to break things on the outside. And to agree, nonetheless, prior to an incarnation to come in and to do those things. I'm going to end the video there because, as you know, it is always my aim and my goal to share information that is interesting or thought-provoking. And I thought this idea of, once it came into me, of his agreement to come in, his soul contract to come in and to do these hurtful things, was not because he is crazy or a monster, but because he had the choice to say no, but chose anyway to come in and to do all of these things for all of our collective consciousness, to help us evolve and to help us grow. So as always, I hope that you have found this to be thoughtful, thought-provoking, and interesting. And also, take what resonates and leave the rest behind. And until next time, stay in the high vibration.